They've lied about communism. Here's what they have never told you. They've told you communism was built for the people, a system of fairness, equality, and shared wealth, a way to finally end exploitation and destroy class division and create a world where everyone has enough and is equal. They say it under communism. The workers own the factory, the farmer owns the land, the people control the system. No more billionaires, no more poverty, no more injustice. That's the story. And if you only read the theory, if you only see the surface, it sounds like the ultimate solution to everything. Capitalism gets wrong. But what they didn't tell you is what happens when theory meets reality. They didn't tell you how quickly power centralizes, not in the hands of the many, but in the hands of a very specific few. They didn't tell you that collective ownership often means government ownership and that the people rarely get a say in how the power is used. They didn't tell you that incentives disappear, that innovation completely dies out, that production slows, and that to keep the system alive, the state has to do two things: control information and control people. And that's exactly what they did not want. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's not an emotional outburst. It is historical fact. From the USSR to Mao's China to East Germany to Venezuela, communism has followed the same structural pattern every time. So today, we are not here to debate. We are here to look at what communism actually is, how it works both in theory and in practice, why it always starts with hope and ends in control, and whether in 2025 the renewed interest in communism is based on truth or on the same dangerous myth that's been repackaged for a new generation. Now, before we start, we need to be all on the same page. And to do that, we actually need to go to the book where it all started, which is the Communist Manifesto, right? Which was written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, where communism basically had its origins and where it all started from. Let me read out of the book of its origin and a summary. Comrade, it's time to overthrow your boss. Let's take over the place ourselves and end these miserable working conditions. Maybe subversive thoughts like those have crossed your mind while you have toiled away working, right? Or maybe you have heard politicians accusing other politicians of being communists. Maybe you have even heard someone called a communist or a pinko or a rat, but you don't know what it really means. The Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, is the single document most responsible for launching the often feared political philosophy of communism. It straight up tells you to revolt against the rich. And it tells you why you should. Here's the gist of the manifesto, fast enough for you to read before you have to wake up and slave away in your job. Marx describes how the bourgeoisie, the rich capitalists, rose to power over the aristocrats, kings and feudal lords. How the capitalists maintain power and how they are now confronted by the proletariat, the working poor who are paid wages, who as communists will overthrow them. Once the proletarians take care and charge, they are supposed to set up a vanguard state, a temporary government to transition society from capitalism to communism. This will be a system where the most important private property, that means production of factories, agriculture, land, machinery, will be shared in common and no one will profit to exploit others. Yeah, it's an incredible, controversial work. A lot of people blame the Communist Manifesto for the fact that Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin put tens of millions of people into gulags, enforced labor camps, and committed all kinds of horrors. On the other hand, some say communism has never been implemented properly, perhaps because the continued existence of rival capitalism doesn't allow it. Authors like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels didn't win any award for this document, but they got a bigger prize, the Manifesto, which is primarily Marx's work, famous because it changed the world and still does. It inspired the leaders of the Russian Revolution to overthrow Tsarist aristocracy and set up the communist Bolshevik government that led to the communistic Soviet Union. One of the most powerful countries over the 20th century, China, Cuba, and other countries consider themselves communists to this day. All that would have happened if Marx inspired by the bad working conditions of the workforce hadn't written this little book. So as you can see in the initial idea of what communism is, it is about changing certain conditions, especially the conditions for the normal people, the normal working force that is slaving away in wages, right? It's kind of like what we do nowadays if people talk about escaping the matrix and escaping the rat race. It's the same inspiring idea of not following into the footsteps of everyone else and being under unfavorable conditions as most people are. It is about giving people the power, giving a normal person power and consolidate all of the power in equal and not just in a top 1% as we have it in capitalism. Because capitalism is the direct opposite of communism, where a certain amount of percent have all the power and all the money. As for example described in Rich Dad, Poor Dad's book by Robert Kiyosaki, 5% of the people own 95% of the money and 95% of the people own only 5% of the money. So in a general idea, communism actually makes sense. But blaming it, as just described in the book, on capitalism, and capitalism would have never allowed it, is also pretty weak in my opinion. So the ground idea kind of makes sense. It's about averaging out everything, making everyone equal, and taking away all the private ownership over things, factories, and people, and giving it to anyone. But how it actually played out, as we have seen in history, is the direct opposite, and millions of people have lost their life. But you also need to understand there's a lot of misconception about communism. They are not really honest on where communism comes from and what actually was the idea. They say the Russians, but was it really just Russians? We will speak about that. Now, nearly all of the communistic regimes ended in censorship, fear, and economic collapse. And the reason for that is that if you average out on everything, you are essentially killing production. You are killing a certain urge in every human's conditioning, which is rising to the top, becoming more powerful, becoming stronger, and having an incentivation. Because in communism, there is no incentive to do anything. Leaders of big sales forces, leaders as I, that run big communities, we know that with a fair and equal idea for everyone, the system will not become stronger. It will actually average out and it will go down faster than it will go up or stay the same. The communistic idea is that everyone stays and everything stays the same and everyone is equal. But unfortunately, as a plant doesn't grow anymore, it dies out. We have this in nature, right? Everything in nature that does not grow will die. And that's what we saw in communistic regimes, where they had to come up with censorship and fear, and everything collapsed afterwards, and millions over millions of people have lost their lives. And that is because I truly believe, with a very simple example, if you give 10 weak people power, then it's going to be a weak outcome. If you give a group of 10 where 2 are very strong, very disciplined, very morally strong, ethical, good leaders and have good intentions, if you give them the power instead of the 8 other ones that are just average, that are not really pushing in life, that don't have anything going on for themselves, that don't want to become better, they actually just want to relax. And I'm purposefully explaining it in more generic terms and more nowadays terms because I want everyone to understand it, because what I found out is every time we talk about communism, there's a certain way on how it's described in a very complicated way for most people to understand. So I want to bring it down onto a more average level so everyone can understand it. So if you give power to the 8 instead of the 2, we know that it's not going to go better for this community, for this group, right? If we follow the 8 weak ones, because weak men and weak leaders will create weak circumstances and therefore a weak future. But if we give the power to the 2 strong, most likely, not always, but most likely with a higher outcome, we will have a more efficient, a more wealthy, a better overall average for everyone, because the 2 pushing will lift up the quality of life of the 8 others. Again, not always, but most of the times. Now, a question we need to ask ourselves is, can a system built on forced equality ever create true freedom, or does it just shift who's in control? And I truly believe it's impossible to create true freedom for everyone and for the average, because it's against the nature. It's against survival of the fittest. It is against nature's laws, where everything that does not grow dies out. The weak ones will always create weak circumstances, where the strong ones create most of the time strong circumstances. So I think that communism was used to shift control by lying to the people at the end of the day, creating this utopian mindset of if you follow this and this and this, everyone will be the same, everyone will average. And you need to kind of go back in time and think about the circumstances that most people lived in. Circumstances for an average person was insanely bad. There was no water, there was no real work, there was a lot of people that had no jobs, there was no food on a daily basis on the tables. Economically, the countries, especially like if you go into the Soviet Union before, even during communism, but even before, were most likely in a very difficult state, right? So you did not have the circumstances right now where we would say everyone has a great life and everyone is going to be equal in socialistic countries, Germany, for example, which you see Germany has been a very well-known socialistic country, more so capitalistic back in the time, led by very strong output in exports through their big brands like Mercedes-Benz, Hugo Boss, Porsche, Volkswagen, and so on. And over the last, let's say, 2 decades, Germany became more socialistic, letting everyone into their country, averaging everything out, making everyone equal, trying to make everyone equal. And there's never been more division in the country. There's never been more crime in the country. There's never been more dissatisfaction. There's never been a worse quality of living in Germany than right now. And we as humans truly believe that impacting something and changing something is pretty easy when it comes to thinking of nations, of people, where we say if everyone is just equal, everyone is going to have a better life. But there is people that are below the average, and for them maybe it's going to be a better life. But there's also a lot of people above the average or average that are going to be taken down, right? So if you think about, let's say 100% is the top millionaire, billionaire lifestyle, right? You're top 1% in that sense, okay? And then you have 0%, which are people that cannot even afford food, have no income and sleep on the street. And then you have 50%, which is they have not too much, but not too little. They have a great life. They can afford a house. They can afford a car. They can take care of their family. It is enough that one person, mostly the man back in the times, if I think back to my grandpa from my German side, he had a good job in Switzerland, made good money, had a beautiful house, was paying it off, right? Had a nice car, was taking care of his daughters, my mother, and had a good life, you know? Now you are basically turning a country into more socialistic and more, let's say, woke narratives, and then compare it to communism, for example, which is for me like a kind of a new age communism. Same thing, just under a different explanation, under a different blanket with a little bit less drastic change, but overall it's gonna end up in the same difficulties and in the same problems, where again now if you look into Germany being one of the strongest socialistic country where everyone wants to go to and everyone is welcome, has crises that we have never seen before. And now the 50% average is now sitting on 30%, right? People that have a good life and had a good life, a safe life, working hard, now are experiencing life 20% worse than before, right? And that's because we are bringing the average down. Because if the average of people, right, in the room are not hardworking, just want to benefit from the government, have no goals for themselves, and these make 80% of the society, then they are gonna define the society. There's rules and numbers and statistics where the highest statistic obviously makes the average. Because I don't truly believe that that's how people should think and live their life. I rather personally live in a capitalistic system where I'm forced to work harder, to personally develop myself, to have the chance, free chance and equal chance, not to everyone because it doesn't exist, right? But in general, more than being in a communistic country is gonna benefit the society, myself and my family and my personal well-being more than just crying about circumstances. Because one thing that communism speaks for and actually against is that we are actually creatures of creating circumstances. We are not creatures that are bound to circumstances. It's not like there's a circumstance and then there's nothing we can do. We create circumstance. And communism speaks exactly against it, that we are no creators. We cannot create, we rather all be average and then everything is good. And capitalism speaks for creation. And I rather live in a society where we create. It is at the end of the day a shift of control, to come back to the original question, under the blanket of making it sound good for the average people to comply and follow. Because what a nation, a unification or a country has to do is control their people. That's why it's called government, right? Govern your mind. There's many ways on how to govern it. In my opinion, capitalism so far has been the best one as long as we have free markets, which we don't really have. But the more we go into direction of free markets, the better it is for us, because then the more competition there is, and therefore normal people can actually become very successful. But while most countries are turning socialistic, example to communistic, the more the average is going to fall down to less quality in life, less income, and also more control. And that's what we're seeing. I truly believe, and I see that modern influencers sometimes and people romanticize communism while ignoring what actually happened. Most people, for example, call out nationalistic Germany and how many Jews were unfortunately killed, right? But most people don't actually know that around 30 to 60 million Russians or Soviets were killed basically in around that time of communism. So communism has killed more than dictatorships or fascism, right? And we always speak about fascism. Why don't we speak about the casualties and how actually bad communism was? One of them that speaks up a lot about communism is the Gulag Archipelago that I also read. And obviously many, many more books, if it's the Communist Manifesto, if it's Foundation of Leninism, State and Revolution, Melting Pot, right? There's many more I'm going to read. And no one really speaks about how bad it actually was. And people are talking about how good communism is, but it's just a weak mind and an uneducated mind, obviously, but mostly a weak mind that thinks of fairness in the way of if everything is fair for everyone, it is good for everyone. And we're gonna maintain a good average and people are gonna keep the same lifestyle that they have, not understanding that they're actually privileged growing up in the capitalistic system where they maybe had a little bit of a head start by just being born into the right country, by just being born into the right family, by just being born in the right time where they have access to free education and a success ladder that they can climb if they actually work hard, because they are paid by their value, they are paid by how much value they provide in the marketplace, they are paid by discipline, they are paid by work, force and energy. And communism is the direct opposite. You have no incentives to work harder. There's no real idea and concept where you get any advantage of making something out of yourself. So people talk about communism and ignore completely where it actually came from and what it did and what actually happened in the past, or especially in the USSR, right? And Mao's China or Venezuela or let's say Cuba. So I truly believe when people speak about communism and we should go back to it, they are insanely uneducated, they are most likely weak personalities, and they are more in the mindset of being a victim to circumstances. I truly believe that there's two people here. There's people, we have spoken about it, there's people that think they are creators of circumstances. That's what I think. And then there's people that believe in communism, and there are mostly also people that believe they are victims of circumstances. So it's two different mindsets. It's a strong and the weak. Now again, capitalism has also shown it can go wrong. But overall, on average, capitalism has a greater addition to life than communism, and no one can debate that. No one can debate that. I live in the UAE, which is probably the most capitalistic, but also the fairest marketplace with right now the most stable economy in the world. And it's a perfect example of fair market. It's a perfect example of capitalism. And it's a perfect example of how capitalism can increase the quality of everyone's life that possesses the right attitudes and promotes the right attitudes, whether communism promotes nothing but being and staying average, not pursuing anything. And that is why capitalism creates also inequality, 100%. There always needs to be inequality. This fairy tale idea of everyone is the same cannot exist in nature. It's a linear system in a dynamic world. Linear systems in a dynamic world that shifts cannot be implied. It doesn't work mathematically. It is impossible. So why are we trying to do that? Why are we trying to bring down 80% of the people to a lower average to make 20% of the population happy, while in capitalism, 80% of the people are having a good life and 20% are not? Are we deciding for the 80% or are we deciding for the 20%? Are we gonna make 80% people life feel like the 20% or the opposite? And that's what we need to ask ourselves the question. And that is just logic. And yes, 100%. Capitalism and every system will create inequality. But communism creates universal poverty. So we need to decide, do we want to have universal poverty as it has happened? Or do we want to have inequality that people can still come out if they fight and they are strong? Can you have collective ownership without destroying individual motivation or innovation? And I truly believe no, because what should be the incentive for it? The incentive for what I do in a capitalistic system and trying to go as high as possible in the hierarchy, and I'm pretty high. I live like the top 1 to 3% in this world. I have a 7-figure income. I have learned beautiful skills, capitalistic skills of investing and trading. I live in a 170 square meter right in front of Burj Khalifa apartment, which is brand new. I have more than I need. I have everything double or triple. I need to ask myself when I wake up which car I want to drive today. This is the top 1 to 3% of everyone's life. But it's because I came from basic, I came from not having enough money to this because I created positive attitudes. I learned discipline, I learned skills, I was motivated because I could have gotten and I got incentivized. But in an individual system where collective ownership is promoted, it's gonna destroy innovation. Why should I innovate? Why should I go up front? Why should I try to be better? Because I'm not gonna have any benefit in it. The benefit in capitalistic structures is obvious. It's a greater experience of life. Now, a good example for this is if you go into the leadership of communism, why the leaders of communist states always live like kings while everyone else stands in the line for food and bread. And again, it's what I said before. Communism is not about making it for everyone. It's about how can we create a system that people believe in so they don't revolt and say anything against the top 1 or 5%. That's the same in democracy, and it's the same in capitalism, and it's the same in communism. The only question is, do you want a fairer system where you actually can become part of the 1%? Or do you want a system where you believe that everyone is doing good and well, but there's zero chance of you becoming 1%? That's what communism is. So here's a good example. All of these leaders we have just been speaking about, they have lived their lives like kings while everyone else was starving. I truly believe that communism was a complete economical moral failure and a complete control mechanism failure. Because if you are a tyrant, and the same goes for capitalistic or dictator or fascism or whatever, if tyrants are tyrants for too long, the people are going to revolt against it. And that's what happened with communism. Look, at some point we have to stop confusing good intentions with good outcomes. And that's what I was saying before. Communism promises equality but always delivers control. It's not just an economic model, it is a system of complete obedience where freedom becomes a threat to the plan, right? So if you want freedom, you are a threat. Every time it fails, they say it wasn't real communism, we could not implement it. But how many times does it have to fail before we stop failing for that excuse? And you can critique capitalism, and you should, every system, but don't let your frustration just because you are not pushing hard, just because you are lazy, right? Push into a system that failed every time it has been tried and has obliterated millions of people. This isn't about left or right, it's about power. Who has it and who keeps it and who they take it from. So you are serious about truth, not trends. You are in the right place. Hit the follow and question everything. See you in the next one.